Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion on another Tuesday here on Wadawurrung country. That's the country I come in from, which is and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians, the Wadawurrung people, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who happen to be joining us live or on the replay today. My special guest today is not too far up the road from me, but I believe on different country. Did you want me to call you Winnie or Winitha?
Yeah, you can call me Winnie. Winnie for
Winnie,
sure.
beautiful. We didn't get to that before. So, Winnie, whose country are you coming in from today?
I'm coming from a range, but for me, in terms of acknowledgement to country, where I'm at now in my journey is actually making it part of my everyday practice and being. So when I am walking on, like we're walking on country right now, and so for me, every step that I take, particularly when I do my meditation in the morning, it's for me, in terms of acknowledgement to country, what I'm trying to do is, rather than just saying it, is to really, really practice it and to feel it. And importantly, be there for my clients, check on them, send them text messages, encourage them as well. So in terms of my acknowledgement, I just want to acknowledge the richness of this country, the incredible amount of wisdom that First Nations people have in terms of being, in terms of living and working and connection. And I want to acknowledge the strength and their resilience that they have, and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as any First Nations colleagues that are listening. And I just want to communicate my absolute commitment to elevating the voices of First Nations people, and to do whatever I can through my work, and just by simply being on this land, to just really acknowledging that sovereignty never ceded, and this land always was and will always be Aboriginal land. But importantly, what am I doing throughout my day to really feel that and to practice that? So something even really simple as recycling. I've been really, really conscious of how I'm recycling, and how, because that all ends up in this sacred land, in this sacred country. And rather than just as part of my training, like saying acknowledgement, like how am I going above and beyond to really live that and to really breathe that? Yeah, and I've just been really inspired by their stories and how they really take care of country and land. And if we all live by those principles, we'd be in a completely different place, environmentally and sustainably as well.
Absolutely. What a beautiful reflection. And thank you for sharing that with us. I was reflecting this week over, it was a separate issue. It was around gender equity, but somebody said to me something that I've heard many times before when I was correcting them on the use of the word girls in relation to women. And I happened to bring up a point of history, and that to support my point. And the response I got back was, well, gosh, how long ago was that? That's not the here and now. And I reflected on that in terms of the way so many Australians do reflect on the way we are engaging with Aboriginal people, and this idea that what's happened in the past is in the past and it's not our responsibility. Which is so awful to hear, but it's also quite a challenging thing that we face across multiple dimensions of diversity and inclusion work in workplaces. I think getting people to recognise history, and I think there's no better example of that than when it comes to the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So thank you for that reflection. That's really a beautiful way to start today. Winnie, I want to give you a chance now to tell your story. people are really loving this as the intro to these conversations, as we've had a chance to get to know so many people who are working in diversity and inclusion, or interested and passionate in diversity and inclusion, and hearing how they got to be working in this space. And I'm really, really excited to hear your story, if you're happy to share it with us.
Yeah. So my pronouns are she, they, and I've gone on a really, massive journey in my life. As a young person, I was really attracted to documentaries that told stories that I wasn't exposed to. So I watched a lot of documentaries on the journey of a transgender person, what they would go through on the civil rights movement in America, even documentaries about, Black Panthers, and that really, really sparked my interest in people that had gone through a lot of pain and trauma and suffering in their life. But within that story, I saw such an incredible amount of strength and courage, but also vulnerability in seeking to live and breathe their way in a really, in a way that felt true and honest to them, not to the world. And that really connected and resonated with me because, I grew up in a very traditional household, and I was really, looking at my own view of the world. And, I never questioned any of that. Everything just felt right about it. Like those movements, everything just felt like it just made perfect sense to me, because in those stories, I kind of connected with my own struggles of the world defining me as XYZ, and this inner person inside of me saying, well, that actually doesn't feel like that's true and honest and real for me. And so that's what's led me now to do this work as a, like yourself, as a D&I consultant. And I was actually talking with a friend on the weekend saying to her that I think anyone that chooses this line of work has never chosen this line of work because of rainbows, unicorns, and fairy dust. Unfortunately, it's born through your own lived experience. It's born through your own struggles of identity and existing in a world that says that you need to fit into a box. And it's born through the struggles of pain and suffering and trauma. And this is how we are healing ourselves, by also spreading that message in the world, and also in the hope that others don't have to go through what we went through. So yes, I work with corporates and councils, and I do a lot of work with people of color around leadership and entrepreneurship. But this work has definitely stemmed from it's taken, like most practitioners, taken an academic kind of trajectory, but it always comes back to not just my lived experience, but the lived experience of others around me, and always staying in that sort of moment of observation. So
yeah, beautiful. Can we maybe drill in to that a little bit, that idea that for so many, and for the majority really of people working in diversity and inclusion, there has been a number of moments of potential pain, trauma, as you described, a sense of exclusion, essentially, and that gives us that passion to want to create the opposite. What do you think are the pitfalls of that? I suppose that you're working in a space where you really are having to put yourself in situations that are likely to be potentially triggering, that are likely to be really challenging to deal with, because you're actually hearing the things that you'd probably prefer not to hear.
Oh my God, so true. Yeah, I mean, I always say that I have a very high level of not just tolerance, but compassion in terms of creating, because for me, inclusion is creating space for others to have space. And that also means for people, to actually do this work, like the people that actually need to be in the room. And so as you will know in your practice, like you hear and see a lot of things. And 99.99% of the time, I'm like, okay, but that 0.01% of the time, it will really get to me. And so that's why having, really safe, nurturing spaces such as, like you and I connected a while ago, having those spaces with other D&I practitioners is really, really important, because first of all, it's, we're dealing with lived experience, our own and others. So from a practitioner perspective, we need to be checking in with others in terms of this, what's going on for me. Like, am I responding or am I reacting to, what's going on for me? And to actually do that with someone that you trust and you respect. So, you are someone that, I trusted, and I just, I really respected a lot. And so having that space with you to say, hey, this is what I heard, saw, this is what I was feeling and thinking. What do you think from a practitioner level? And then also from a person with their own lived experience, what have you gone through, to give me, compassion and empathy and comfort as well. So I think for me, what I've really realized is I can't stay really stuck in my head. I need to move my body, and I need to really check in with another practitioner that is doing very similar work, working in those same spaces. Because there are a lot of people that do D&I work, but we all work in different spaces and different audiences, and we face different challenges. So that has been absolute key for me. Another thing that I've been trying to do, which hasn't been very successful in terms of consistency, is actually every month, taking at least 4 days off, where I just totally stay unplugged and just do something that is absolutely non-D&I related. Because I don't know about you, but for me, like, I'm always constantly observing. So even when I took my dog for the walk, I saw a parent and their child, and they were using Auslan, like they were, engaging in sign language. And then the kid came up to me, and I found myself in a situation where I was like, how do I communicate in a way that's going to be inclusive, with the burdens on me as opposed to them, because that's what they tend to go through. So even though I'm out there relaxing, like, my head was spinning, my D&I wheels were spinning. So I realized that I need to take that time out and do non-D&I related activities to really switch my brain off.
That's really good advice, and certainly something that I need, and I can relate so well to that. And it's, I play cricket, as many people know, and you walk into a cricket club, and I want to do that as that's my hobby, that's my mindfulness activity, that's my version of meditation. But I get there and I'm constantly bombarded by these messages of gender and of gendered expectations, and it's incredibly difficult to switch that part of your brain off and just participate as a team member like everybody else gets to. And so I can totally relate to that, kind of those incidental, you're constantly observing and witnessing those types of moments of exclusion or inclusion and the impact they're having.
Yeah.
I like how you've used the word compassion a couple of times now, and this word's been really at the front of my mind recently. And I think I've mentioned it in one of these lives before, so I'll apologise to listeners if it's repetitive. But one of the things that a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Network mentioned in one of our early sessions was how it's important to get people into that empathy space to engage them with D&I work. And we know that. That's why we share lived experience. That's why we engage people with the work. But then we can't sit in that empathy for too long. We actually have to move them into compassion, and compassion is action. And that's something I didn't understand before and hadn't really unpicked. Is that something that's come out in your practice as to how you shift people from that empathy to actually taking action and having compassion?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things that I speak about in my training is actually moving from empathy to compassion, because the thing with empathy is we tend to develop empathy around situations and people and circumstances that are actually the most familiar to us. And so therefore there is bias within that. So, there's someone that has faced discrimination around, gender, because that's really close to me, I will develop empathy around that much more rapidly, much more quicker than someone who had a completely different lived experience to me. And so that's one thing that, I think with empathy, and a place of just personal frustration for me is that I feel like empathy is, because it's kind of linked to awareness, is people's excuse to really stay stuck, like, oh, I need to develop more empathy and awareness in order to do this work. And it can keep people really stuck. And the other reason is that empathy is around pain and suffering, and as opposed to solutions and actions and moving forward. Whereas compassion asks you to take actually a step away from empathy and to ask yourself, what can I do to help? Because if we stay as individuals, if we stay really stuck in pain and suffering, it can really immobilize us. It can re-traumatize us. It can trigger like totally unrelated trauma that's sitting in our nervous system. It can just really keep us really stuck in pain and suffering. And I also think that it's kind of like a bit of action. And so, yeah, absolutely. The conversation that I also have with my clients is that, we need to be moving to compassion, because compassion has empathy, but it's just taken a step further and asked, what can you do? What can you contribute as a leader? How can you support, facilitate, and, put some consideration around the situation to actually start to move forward.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, I feel like I've got that now. I feel like I've got that concept in my head that's been floating around for a while, and I love the way you've articulated that. I'm interested in shifting a little bit, or not shifting. It's a similar conversation, but around being a DEI practitioner. There's obviously people who are watching who might be like us, working externally to organisations and sometimes internally. But there's also a lot of people tuning in who are in HR roles in an organisation, have been told that you've got the diversity and inclusion work to run with now, or they're in internal diversity and inclusion roles, but they may be quite new to it. What would your advice, and I get asked this question all the time, so that's why I'm interested in hearing what you think. What are your thoughts on what are the real key skills of somebody who's going to drive, say, a diversity and inclusion strategy or plan in their organisation? What should they be honing if they're now tasked with this work?
Definitely that skill set around anti-fragility. So I know I've definitely need to cultivate that in myself. It is something that I add as a layer on top of the work that I do, which is there is no better work to build anti-fragility, because resilience is pushing against something. And this is from Nassim Taleb's work, but resilience is when you have the ability to push against change. What we actually need organizations to do in D&I is to see the opportunity in hardship, in challenges, in changing the status quo. And the ultimate benefit is the opportunity to create anti-fragility, that as you embrace tough conversations, tough work, and you actually start to go down that journey, it actually makes you stronger as a result. Like, there is ultimately no better work than this work, to build an anti-fragile organizational culture, to build an anti-fragile, mindset as a leader. So I think as a practitioner, the first thing that we need to be building is that mindset, because we will face CEOs that put your hands behind your back, or maybe just one hand behind your back, and say, you can't say this, can't say that, can't do this, can't do that. We might face a board that think everything's fine and chirpy, etc. So we'll face, regardless if you're an external or an internal practitioner, you need to develop that number one skill. And and I believe that's also a form of actual self-care, because Audre Lorde, the famous, Black queer, poet, and, just an incredible source of wisdom, said, self-care is actually an act of is actually a political act. It's an act of warfare. So I think when we start to do this work, building that anti-fragility muscle is what's actually really needed in order for us to do this work in the long term and to actually start to make some inroads, because we will come across really large blocks, and that is systemic structural discrimination, in practice. And we will actually be going on that journey ourselves as individuals. So the other thing is, sometimes I see with other, particularly people that have just started this career for the first time, is we come in with our own lived experience when we're actually just a vessel, a channel for the lived experience of everyone. So that's another mind shift that I definitely encourage. And the other one is shifting from where inclusion is just part of the business to where inclusion is actually how you do business. So for me, what I teach and what I do is, we have diversity and inclusion. I think the next is integration. So if we look at, a business model on a page, or they call it like a business canvas, if we were to lay inclusion on the top, what would your distribution channels look like? What would your procurement processes look like? Who would your client database be? How would you be serving, communicating to them? Who would your key stakeholders be? So if, rather inclusion being like this separate block or portfolio that kind of is another pillar to the business, what if it ran horizontally and vertically through the business, where it was really integrated into your DNA? So, so I think we can get really, really lost in initiatives. We can get really lost in, celebration. And for me personally, the last couple of years, in terms of social media, like I've really pulled back on celebration, in terms of, weeks and celebrating that, because for me, it's, I see my clients do it all the time. And for me, it's actually quite personal. So people from those communities, like, how am I supporting them? It's using that as a period of really sort of real deep reflection, accountability to myself and to that community of like, how am I showing up? How am I serving, those groups, those individuals, and using that moment of actual silence to start to go really, really deep within, to think about what would this work look like if it actually went beyond celebration and moved into change, because that's where the real celebration is. And importantly, how am I serving those individuals? How am I elevating them personally, not just professionally as well, colleagues and other practitioners. And so so that's the other thing that I would really encourage, is to, you're just simply a vessel. And also, like, how can we shift organizations from initiatives and celebrations to doing that tough work, and what does that work actually look like?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. That's and I love the idea of a vessel. I often feel like that. It feels like it's our job to be making sure that those lived experiences do become centred and of everybody's within that workplace, and that's kind of our role, to make sure that those voices get amplified. We've got some questions here before we wrap up today. So I'm going to go with Kath first. What kind of general cues, behavioural indicators, etc., should our leaders look for when moving their organisation through a D&I strategy and plans to ensure that it's being effective and being institutionalised? Good one.
I would say humility. So I know there is, and Bree, you might know this else as well, like there is research that shows that when leaders stuff up, are humble about it, and communicate that people's perceptions of them being inclusive leaders, goes up by, I think the data says, 25% or 33%. So I think that's really important and key, saying that, I don't have all the answers. I am not a D&I expert. That's why we hired Bree. So we're doing the work, but just letting you know, I will stuff up. And when I do, actually, communicating that and doing so with a sense of humility, because I think that absolutely gives permission for others to not intentionally stuff up, but to acknowledge the learning within that and the growth. We keep talking about growth mindset, but real growth mindset happens in including diversity inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that too, going back to that, you were talking before about being anti-fragile. Yeah. I'd add to that, I think we need our leaders to be that as well when it comes to this work. And, often I talk to leaders about, you need to step into that. I know it's uncomfortable and I know it's scary. You might get called out, but you've got to put yourself in that place and push through that. We've got one more question here before we wrap up. DI roles need to become part of the C-suite rather than a tag-along role. What will it take for this transformation to take place?
Hi, Peter. Yeah, absolutely. I haven't seen much movement in terms of that here in Australia. In the States and the UK, yes. But unfortunately not here in Australia. So I feel for us, it's just simply a bit of a slow grind. I think as organizations, first of all, I really believe that organizations do need, regardless if they have an internal D&I lead, that they absolutely do need an external consultant to come in. It doesn't have that attachment, that it's not dealing with the organization day in, day out, that is spread across multiple clients and has been able to see that the diversity within that of outcomes, solutions, initiatives, work, and things like that, and to actually bring the best bits of that to the table. And I think, as you start to work with an external practitioner and you start to see traction, then I think that's when organizations and leaders, unfortunately, see the value. Because I know the individuals that have kind of jumped and put in someone in terms of C-suite, like that individual a year or two later has then left because of systemic structural, discrimination. People that do this work are people with lived experience of discrimination. So I think a much more effective approach is actually working with someone else who isn't, in that job 24/7 hours a day. But also is seeing, beyond best practice, bringing that to the table, supporting you to integrate that. So getting you to do the work as opposed to them actually doing the work. And then as you start to develop, so as you start to go from lost, confused, and overwhelmed to feeling a bit more confident, a bit more courageous, a bit more capable, then you start to see the benefits of that, then that's going to give you the internal cues of, hey, we actually need to make this move and put someone in a role and make that suite role reporting directly to the CEO or to a board.
Oh, it's amazing how much we agree on this stuff, because I really think we see way too much. The practice is, we need to do diversity and inclusion. All right, we've got a bit of money, we'll employ someone. I notice my camera's just gone fuzzy. We'll employ someone and they can do the work, and we'll employ them at a junior role. We won't give them any resources around them to actually go out and do the work that's required. And we won't give them the, as Peter points out, we're not giving them the authority anyway to act on the change that needs to happen. So I couldn't agree more. Obviously, that's why we do the work in the way that we do it, act as external consultants, because it's easier for us to be able to do that starting piece, is my belief, and it's more effective. And then they can recruit someone who actually has the skills that organisation needs to drive their inclusion work forward, because every organisation has different needs, and they won't know that till they do that initial work. We are right on time. I could go on forever and chatting with yourself, but we will zip up at 12:30. Thank you so much, Winnie, for coming on and sharing and being so open and authentic with us in this space, talking about the challenges that you face and that as a profession we face on a daily basis. So thank you to you. Everybody for tuning in. Again, big thanks. Thanks for those who are tuning in every week. And I hope it seems from the chat and from the conversations that you're certainly getting a lot out of these. And I can see from the replays that you're also sharing them. So please continue to do that. As always, let me know if there's guest topics you want to talk about. We're always interested in new things that perhaps I'm missing, because obviously my bias is generating the guests that I ask onto the show. So please feel free to let us know if there's anything else you need. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Winnie, and I'll catch everybody next week.
Yay.